to Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillahi. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah that we are entering into our first session with the book directly. In the introductory session, we began to speak a little about the content of the text, the style, the purpose of why it was written. And we noted that this book, which I retitled it The Reliance of the Devoted Servant and Skilled. And here we're talking about those that have taken on a profession, as well as those that are committed to ibadah. The reality of how it is that Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio wrote this book is so that the student early on can become acquainted with what is essential to know in regards to the knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah as it pertains to Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. And we alluded to that in the last session. There is some work that we want to do before going into the text. We wanted to cross reference this text with other texts. Three texts in specific: Umdat al Bayan, which is translated, Tarwih al Ummah, which is translated as well, and Tawfiq al Muslimin, which is translated as well. Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi rahmatullahi alayhi expands on some of the ideas that he brings up in the reliance of the devoted servant. He expands on some of the ideas that he introduces in this work and those other works, and he takes a different route in terms of how he's talking about the issues. About the issues of Usul al-Din, he clearly is following a tendency of thought within Islamic scholarship that's separating between what is essential to know in Aqidah as far as it being an individual obligation, Fard al-Ain, from that which is considered to be Fard al-Kifaya, or collective obligation to know, or that which is a detailed knowledge which is only used on specific occasions with need. And so when it comes to the matters of Aqidah, that's the approach he takes. And part of that development, it comes also from being concerned with the development of the individual to be a practicing individual in the community. And so we see a similar concept with Imam Sha'rani, who Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi rahmatullahi alayhi draws from. We see similar concept with Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq, who Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio draws from. And we see similar with Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, which Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio draws from. May Allah have mercy on all of them. We'll come back to some other points, but let's begin with the text. We initiate this session by referring to page 6 of the PDF itself. And here, Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi, and we mentioned this before, but we have a saying, my teacher used to say it quite frequently. May Allah accept him and have mercy on him. He passed away. Sheikh Sa'd al-Jawaish, who was from the scholars of Hadith of al-Azhar al-Sharif. And he blessed me with Ijaz and Isnad. He used to say, Fil iyada ifada. Fil iyada ifada. Fil iyada ifada. That basically in returning to a matter, there's benefit. Especially when we start talking about uh, knowledge and learning, review and review, in overview, and returning back to the lessons, there's benefit. Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi, he begins by saying that he composed the book, and in the typical style of the scholars, he gives the reason why he composed. In the past, unlike in today's time, the scholars will compose books for a specific purpose, not necessarily for just coming into the issue of writing for the sake of writing. The subject is dealing with a classical Islamic text from the Timbuktu tradition, which it was written in West Africa, and it has a certain. Someone asked about what the subject is, and it has a certain style of writing which is unique to it, even though we call it a classical text, mostly because it outlived its time in that sense. But the book is focused on teaching us what's essential to know in Islamic knowledge, and the book is coming to clarify certain points. So he says that he composed the book to explain what Allah teaches in the Quran and what He teaches in the Sunnah. So here he says concerning the science of the foundation of Deen, or we call it Usul al-Deen, and then he says as well as the outward and inward branches of Deen. He wrote this book to clarify the contents of those three areas of knowledge based on what it is that the Quran teaches and what the Sunnah teaches. So here he uses a classification system for knowledge, which was something that was very popular that the scholars engaged in. Dr. Uthman Bakr, Uthman with an O, Bakr from the scholars of Asia, I believe that he's Malaysian. He wrote a book called Classification of Knowledge in Islam. And the scholars in the past, scholars of Islamic sciences, and Islamic sciences consisted in the past of knowledge which pertains to experimentation and reason, as well as knowledge which pertains to revelation. The idea of Islamic sciences was pretty expensive. And so the reality of the situation is that no, you're not bothering me. I was just trying to uh, I was trying to get a certain amount of knowledge in, and then I was going to refer to your question with time. We as Muslims, we believe in all the prophets, and we believe that Jesus is a prophet as well. So the reality is that the scholars, they classified knowledge, and when we talk about Islamic knowledge, it never was separate, especially in the later days of Islamic civilization. It was never like the sciences that pertain to like mathematics, or they pertain to understanding the world. They were called Islamic sciences as well, because those sciences aided us in understanding uh, that the world is purposeful, and that God is one, and so on and so forth. It's not like now where we talk about secular knowledge and religious knowledge. That type of division wasn't there in the same way. In any event, the scholars, they classified knowledge. Dr. Usman Bakr, he wrote a book. It's called Classification of Knowledge in Islam, and they focused on that heavily. They focused on that heavily. And that allowed them to be able to gain mastery of knowledge, to be able to classify knowledge and know how to organize it and what has priorities and so on and so forth. In terms of curriculum, in terms of learning, how to organize knowledge. That was a big concern for them. So Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi, he organizes the book around three ideas: that there's foundational knowledge as far as belief is concerned, Then there's that knowledge which governs our outward behavior, and that knowledge which governs our internal life, the internal behavior. And so that's based on the hadith of Jibril, and we mentioned that before in the last session. He quotes Imam Sha'rani here, and I mentioned this before, but I'll quote it again. And Imam Sha'rani was also a scholar that was concerned with that type of concept as well, classifying knowledge and making sure that people can understand knowledge for their development, not just knowledge for knowledge's sake, but for knowledge for their spiritual development. So he quotes Sha'rani, rahmatullahi alayhi, Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani. He quotes him, and Sha'rani immediately prioritizes what needs to be known. He says, indeed, or verily, Allah has made all of his servants, male and female, anyone who reaches the level of maturity in Islam, meaning that they're pubescent, they're sane, they're Muslim. That's what a responsible person is, right? And they're in a conscious state. That's what is considered a mukallif, and a person that fits these qualities should know then at this point that they're responsible for that which Allah has made clear, right? Which Allah has made clear. So here, Sheikh Uthman Fodio goes on to translate what that means. What is meant here is that the pious worshipper and the adab believer should act accordingly to what's clear in the book and the Sunnah, to the Quran and the Sunnah. So there's certain knowledge which is clear, it should be known to all people, and is not categorized or classified as detailed knowledge. It's knowledge which there should be widespread literacy in it. And even the non-Muslim knows that the Muslims have something that is called like 5 cornerstones or pillars, or they know that the Muslims pray X amount of days, 5 times a day. Like that type of knowledge is knowledge which is clear, which is universal, which it should be known. That's what you're responsible for. The details, not every individual has to be responsible for the details of knowledge. So that's the first thing. He organizes our mind so that we know what comes first in the order of learning and in the order of what we're responsible for. Similar to that idea or that way of teaching, you find in Bidayat al-Hidayah by Abu Hamid al-Ghazali an organization of knowledge in such a way that is clear and is simplified, so that you learn it and you're able to put it into practice. So you get like the essential toolkit. And so here it says that you should know what's clear from the knowledge, not the details of it. So what's desired here, the desired knowledge in the above, is that which Allah has made explicit as far as obligation, what we're obligated to know. Here it says it in a little bit of a different way, but that's the meaning. The desired knowledge in the above is that which Allah Ta'ala has explicitly made law. That means that which is an obligation. This is the knowledge for which the servant will be questioned, right? For which the servant will be questioned. Then he moves on and he talks about when are we going to be questioned? Well, in the hereafter. With all of that, there's no harm in it, and it is not difficult for anyone to obtain. Now, here Sheikh Uthman Fodi, he brings up a point, and I reiterated this in the past, and I mentioned in the past, and I'll reiterate it at the moment. He talks about facilitating the way to knowledge, and that's in keeping with the spirit of the Quran. He says, in obtaining this knowledge, one is not in need of spending a whole lifetime. That you don't have to devote all of your life in the pursuit of knowledge to obtain this knowledge. Because if you think about it, if you think about knowledge in that way, it's overwhelming. That you're going to have to spend a lifetime to know what's fundamental in the deen in order to begin to practice. No, we have to clarify that for the people. especially those that are struggling Muslims and those that are no Muslims, and even for the non-Muslims, because they may want to know about Islam. That there's certain things that are just clear cut and essential that need to be known, and that's it. They don't take a lifetime to come to understand them. That's why these types of books also shouldn't be so detailed and drawn out that it takes a lot of time to learn their content. Right? You work through this knowledge, you get a mastery of it, then you go to the next level of knowledge. You increase with a little more detail at the next level, keeping with that spirit. So he mentions this point that is necessary knowledge, and is knowledge that's not requiring a lifetime in order to acquire to know, in order to understand. And this is in keeping with the spirit of the Quran, which emphasizes ease. So then he begins, and then he says that he begins now to enter into usul al-din. And this is on page 8 of the PDF. The title of this section is called Ilm Usul al-Din, or translated as the foundation of the Deen, or the science of the foundation of the Deen. One of the things that's very important to understand is that this type of knowledge is an obligation on every Muslim to know the basic knowledge of what we call Aqidah or Iman, and so on and so forth. Sometimes the idea of Usul al-Din is mixed, or it's confused, or it's made synonymous with Ilm al-Kalam or Aqidah. But what happens there then is that you lose the idea of what's essential. That's why Sheikh Uthman Fodi, he returned back to the reality of separating knowledge according to, or classifying knowledge according to, obligation and level. So he writes in Fath al-Basair that the science of Tawheed is divided into two areas, and he's classifying the ruling now. Usul al-Din, and that's an obligation to know, and Ilm al-Kalam. As for Usul al-Din, or the foundations of the Deen, is part of the individual obligation, whereas Ilm al-Kalam, or or Aqidah, married to philosophical arguments and rational proofs, that is a collective obligation. And what that means, that if some people know that knowledge is sufficient for the community. The community doesn't have a need anymore to have someone to fulfill that role. And if they don't fulfill that role, if you don't have anyone in that capacity, of that specialization, or that level of understanding of knowledge in that way, in that discipline, then the community becomes blameworthy until they can fill that role. And that's usually what Fard al-Kifaya means, with the collective obligation. That there's some things that the community needs, but if some people were to fulfill the task and take on that responsibility, then the rest of the community doesn't have to. In some sense, it's a way of diversifying responsibility. So that's clear, I hope, that the knowledge of Usul al-Din is what everyone should know, which is basically what we find in the Hadith of Jibreel, right? The core of the beliefs that we find in the Hadith of Jibreel. And the details are not for everybody to know by obligation. Some people can know it, and that's sufficient. Not everyone has to know it, because we're questioned about that fundamental knowledge and how we acted and practice on it. Now, the issue that comes up is something that's very important, is that he says that this knowledge is established in the Quran. And here, Sheikh Uthman Fodi, rahmatullahi alayhi rahmatin wasi'a, what he's getting at, because he's really aware of one of the problems which comes up in Ilm al-Kalam. And this problem is clarified by Imam Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, that knowing philosophical ideas about belief is not necessarily going to give us certainty of heart. It's, for some people it may, but for others it may not. And even there's the idea that it can bring in confusion. Also, it's not necessarily the case that because these things are based on rational proofs that they're considered to be based on absolute certain evidences or evidences that are going to yield certainty and not open you up to doubt. And so some of the scholars of Kalam, they made the claim that their argumentation or their defense of beliefs in Islam in a philosophical manner are is done in such a way that is going to be presenting to the people rational proofs that are certain, that don't yield to doubt. And so Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi indirectly is rejecting that and is saying what we can confide in and what we know with certainty and truth to be the conveyor of truth is the Quran. So the Quran itself, you know what I'm saying? The Quran itself, it brings uh, certainty to us. And here in the note it says in the beginning of the affair, Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi used to focus on ilm al-kalam and the Ashari school. And after he reached a certain level of knowledge, and especially a spiritual uh, elevation, where he focused on his relationship with Allah wa ta'ala, he began to lean into the Quran as the source of knowledge, which is revelation, versus rationalization and reasoning. You know, not that the two are automatically opposed, but there's no doubt that the Quran itself is superior. The Quran is superior. And one of the things that comes up here is that what's quoted in the commentary is a statement by Sheikh Abdul Qadir ibn Mustafa, who was a grandson of Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi. And he stated, I have taken an oath and covenant, a bay'ah, to build my aqidah upon the ayat of the Quran and not upon rational proofs and theological positions or theories. So we see that the education that was taking place was an education which was rooting people in this educational orientation that Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi was bringing to the fore. And here he was making the Quran the common ground between people, right? So that the differences at times that come up with philosophical positions, they're not going to come in because we have a common reference point. The sense also that revelation gives certainty is an idea that's being put forward, right? And that's a little different than what the scholars of Ilm al-Kalam are saying. Not all of them, but surely Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali took that position. You begin to see this and also with Sharani, where Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi quotes from. And you see this in Ibn Ajiba and others. And even Ibn Khaldun, and I mentioned this on a live that I did on Facebook, Ibn Khaldun separated between the early scholars of Ilm al-Kalam and the later scholars of Ilm al-Kalam. The later scholars of Ilm al-Kalam focus on philosophy, and the early scholars of Ilm al-Kalam were not so philosophically inclined. And you see that al-Baqalani's approach is not so invested in philosophy as the later day scholars. And there's still within the Ashari school a tendency in which is not so much focused on rational, elaborated theoretical proofs which go into multiple disciplines of knowledge. You see, for instance, like al-Bayhaqi, you see, for instance, like al-Nawawi, like Ibn Hajar, this orientation within the Ashari school that they are away from the philosophical approach. What happens in Aqidah studies is the philosophical approach of some of the later day scholars becomes the dominant approach for everyone. And part of the problem, and I mentioned this in the live as well, that I have is that we're not being sincere or true to Islamic scholarship. Leave aside the issue of condemnation and saying this person deviated and that person is not right. No, just describe the knowledge as it is. And when we describe the knowledge as it is, without having to come to a judgment, we can say that there's a tendency in the ilm al-kalam that became extremely philosophical. And we can say that there's a tendency in the ilm al-kalam that's more sober and is focused on Quran and the Sunnah. And there's a tendency of ilm al-kalam which uses reason to clarify doubts and refute ideas that are un-Islamic. What's wrong with that? That's not going to create any sort of conflict, and what it does is actually gives us scholarly grounding, because then we can understand the different tendencies. Because what's going on here is that Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi is following a revivalist tendency. Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq saw the similar problem. Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali saw the similar problem. They want to bridge between the intellect and the heart and practice. They want the believer to be grounded spiritually. And so what the work of Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi here is to ground and orient the Muslim so that the Muslim can get busy with developing his or her relationship with Allah and having clarity in their deen instead of being confused, and at the same time being able to practice that which is essential without getting lost in having to study for a long period of time. So although the division that he brings up, or the classification of what usul ad-din is philosophical, he's rooting it in the Quran. The idea to divide Aqidah up in terms of ilahiyat, or that which is studying who Allah is or what the rights of Allah are, and the division of nubuwwah or prophethood, and a samiyat. A samiyat is that type of knowledge which is transmitted, which can only be heard. It's not going to come to you by personal inspiration. It's not going to come to you by rationalization. It's going to come to you by a prophet who transmitted to you. And most of that is knowledge of the unseen. Right? Here is translated as the afterlife. The section reads, I say in successes with Allah, realize that Allah Ta'ala has established all of the foundation of the deen in the mighty Quran. It's the ilahiyat, or the divine, the study of the divine, and the prophetic knowledge, and the knowledge of the afterlife. I don't necessarily like the way that it's translated. I translated it a little different than that, and I don't have the time to get it into that right now, because I want to continue with the flow. So we see that he's grounding the knowledge of Aqidah in the Quran. Now, there's some points that I wanted to extract from the sub-commentary. Not everything in the sub-commentary we're going to agree with, but there's some things that are very essential, right? And so here it says that what is obligatory to study is easily understood. That's a logical principle. What's obligatory to study, what you have to know, is easy to understand. The other issue that comes up is that it says, therefore realize that and know it with certainty. Realize what? Right? That knowledge that's obligatory has to be accessible to all people, regardless of their level of knowledge. Right? If that was the case, then people would, if it was the case that that was not true, that knowledge shouldn't be clear and easy, at least at the foundational level of what's obligatory to know, then how is it that we can follow the Prophet and the companions? Because they didn't know, alayhi salatu wasalam, radiallahu anhum, they didn't know all these technical terms and detailed ideas which come up in the study of ilm al-kalam. Let's not get into the issue of bashing ilm al-kalam, if it's an innovation or not. I don't want to get into that argument. I want to get into the argument of that you know the function and role of ilm al-kalam, and you separate out between ilm al-kalam and that which is essential to know, or that which is obligatory to know. And you know that that which is obligatory to know has to be clear. And that knowledge shouldn't take a lifetime to learn. Ilm al-kalam, to master it, you have to put in a lot of effort and time. If you have to put in a lot of effort and time to master it, that means that it's not going to be accessible to all people. And the way of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions should be accessible to the people. not just to the elite scholars. So we have to get into this mindset, right? There's some knowledge that's for scholars because they're experts in a specific area, and there's some knowledge for people who have time because they're free, and then there's foundational knowledge that's for everyone because they can be busy with life or they may not have a lot of time, but they should know it. So every group of people knows this knowledge, right? So that's what he's getting at. So he says that the Quran. This is Muhammad Sharif in the commentary. The mighty Quran is established with us through a successive recurrent transmission. This is what we call mutawatir, a mutawatir transmission. And the idea of the mutawatir transmission across all of the different groups of study in Islam, all of the different groups in Aqidah, in the boundaries of the Sunni school, and even to a great extent, even in the Shia orientation, the mutawatir is that which gives you certainty. So if the Quran has been transmitted by a mutawatir transmission, that means it gives certainty, right? And it's that which you can base yourself in and have confidence in, right? Have confidence in. And with that, people, we closed off this section. Now, one of the things that I wanted to say, wanted to go back to the notes, that in Umdat al-Bayan, he takes on a different turn. In Umdat al-Bayan, he takes on a different turn, and he begins to talk about Aqidah a little more, kind of like in the traditional Ilm al-Kalam sense, with rational proofs. So again, he's not depriving his students of knowing what kind of knowledge is out there, but he's making sure his students definitely know that all knowledge is not the same, and that different types of knowledge serve different purposes. In Tarwih al-Ummah, he lays down 7 issues. And in those 7 issues, 4 of those issues pertain to how to teach Aqidah, right? How to teach Aqidah. And I wanted to use that as a somewhat of as a clarificatory lesson, to use his own words to clarify what he's saying in this book, The Reliance, that we just read. So in the first issue, let me put it to you like this. When you divide the 7 issues up, 4 of them deal with issues of Iman. So I formulated 4 questions, and I classified these 4 issues under Aqidah matters. The first issue that he deals with in Umdat al-Bayan is going to keep in line the same philosophy that you see in Reliance, that we should clarify what's essential to know. It should be rooted in the Quran. It should be easy to understand. It shouldn't take a lifetime to know. So the first question is, what is sufficient to be considered a Muslim? The second is, what is essential to affirm in Tawheed to be safeguarded from punishment in the hereafter? The third is, what does one need to know for having a sound Iman? The fourth is, what is the means that's easy, accessible to us to perfect Iman? So in the first issue, he asks a question and he formulates this almost as if to use the style of a mufti, a person who gives fatwa. If you were to ask, that's the question now comes, so that you have in your mind a sense of priorities. What is the belief? What is that aspect of Iman that is sufficient in applying judgment in this world upon a person so that they're considered a Muslim? It's like, what does a person have to know? What's the essential for a person to know so that a person is classified as a Muslim? And I mentioned some of this in the last session that we dealt with, right? That some of the scholars say that they have to majority of the scholars say that they have to enunciate the shahadatain, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. And a small minority of scholars from among the Hanbali school, they say that if the person were to be seen praying salah, then they're to be assumed that they are Muslim, even if it's the case that it was not heard from them the mention of the shahada, or if a person comes into Islam, they don't take the shahada, but they pray salah, because internal into the shahada is the, I'm sorry, internal in the salah is the shahada. Internal in the salah is the shahada. That's a minority opinion, but to the extent, for us to know what kind of thinking is out there, to that extent, we present those positions. So he says the judgment, right? What the knowledge that can allow us to give a judgment on a person as this person is a Muslim, right? It's based on the consensus of the scholars that if they gave the two testimonies, then we clearly define them as a Muslim, right? And I mentioned that before. And then he says that Sheikh Abdul Salam Ibrahim al-Laqani was a scholar of Ilm al-Kalam and Jawharat al-Tawheed, which is a famous Ashari book. He mentioned that whoever pronounces the Shahadatain has secured for himself to be considered a Muslim in this world, as long as that person doesn't say or do something which contradicts. Then we have to inquire after that, are you a Muslim or not, in that regard. That doesn't mean that we go around checking people, but not the meaning there. The meaning is just that we should know for ourselves what's sufficient to be a Muslim and what may bring some doubt on that. Not that we go around asking people because they may have some errors or mistakes. Are you a Muslim or not? That's not what that means. Sheikh Sanusi, he mentioned in his middle commentary, Sheikh Sanusi has a series of books, the basic level, the intermediate level, the advanced level. So in the intermediate level, he's found to be saying it's not possible for us to have an evil opinion su'adhan regarding the beliefs of another, anyone, whether he be a common person or otherwise, except if there appears openly on the tongue an issue that indicates that he conceals something in his heart which contradicts being a Muslim, right? False belief. Then it becomes obligatory to be kind and tolerant and instructing the person as to what's right because they're saying something that's wrong. And the second issue, so that's the first issue. What is sufficient to be considered a Muslim? The Shahadatain. The second issue, was essential to affirming Tawheed to be safeguarded in the hereafter, right? If you were to ask, what is the knowledge of Tawheed, right, which has to be known so that we're safeguarded in the hereafter, right? The answer is, as Sheikh Sanusi said, I took some freedom to reorient what was said. So it's not word for word Sheikh Uthman then Fodio's question, but I tried to reframe it so it can be a little more clear. Sheikh Sanusi said in Nur al-Sa'ada, a commentary upon al-Barahin, that the establishment of Tawheed, the Tawheed of Allah, the mighty and majestic, with every reasonable person is disputable. However, disbelief occurs when an additional deity is added, right? That the concept here is that if someone openly is worshiping more than one God, then that person is going to have a problem with regard to being safeguarded in the hereafter, right? That's the idea that is being brought up. Just give me 1 second. So the Tawheed itself, declaring the oneness of Allah, right, is that which indisputably protects us. The translation is not all that smooth. And unfortunately, the Arabic version of this text is not easily available. However, this belief occurs when one commits shirk, when one has another deity, right? So then at that point, when a deity is an object of worship. And to be honest with you, people, this can even be our desire. It doesn't necessarily have to be an idol, but anything that's worship other than Allah has to be negated in order for our belief to safeguard us in the hereafter. May Allah allow us to be truly from the people of Tawheed on every level and every sense. Ameen, Ya Rabbi. And so he quotes from Al Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al Arabi al Maliki, who was a student of Imam al Ghazali, in the book called the Siraj al Murideen. Here it says Siraj al Murid, but I found it to be a Siraj al Murideen. Here, Al Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al Arabi al Maliki, rahmatullahi alayhi, says that Tawheed, the science of it, the knowledge of it, has been elevated by some people to such an extent that it becomes impossible for some people to access it or to understand it or to know it because it's become so complicated. However, there's nothing greater than the science of Tawheed, and it should be near to ease. That's the characteristic of the knowledge of Tawheed, that is easy to understand. It shouldn't be complicated and made intricate and so obscure that only a few can understand it. He says, for Allah Ta'ala, this is Al Qadi Abu Bakr, rahmatullahi alayhi, for Allah Ta'ala was content to make its attainment easy and drew it close to his servants with regard to facility or ease. He further commanded them to adhere to this science in a decree by his word to worship Allah and don't associate any deity besides Allah. That's Tawheed. Thus, the true meaning of Tawheed is that you do not make any partners with Allah, and that there is neither creator nor anything to be worshipped besides him. This point here overlaps actually with the idea that some of the Salafis put forward, that it's not enough to say that Allah created us, that we have to move forward to having the right worship, that our worship has to be free of shirk. But at the same time, what some fail to realize is that Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, or acknowledging the greatness of Allah and how Allah masterfully takes care of the creation after creating it and sustains it, that is part of that type of awareness, being really connected to Tawheed al-Rububiyyah in that sense, is that which helps us to perfect our iman. Yes, we have to be clear that our worship is only for Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, but as it said in the fourth issue, the third issue just says that we don't have to know ilm al-kalam, and is detailed as is pointed out in the ilm al-kalam books. But the fourth issue, in facility or ease for the ummah, tarwih al-ummah, it says that the reflection on the creation is one of the best ways to perfect our iman, by examining what's in the heavens of the diverse planets, the sun, the moon, with their waning and completion. It is by examining what is in the earth of benefits and advantages with all of its diversity. Likewise, what is inherent in the earth from water of sweetness and saltiness, and what is profound therein from fruits with their divine taste, even though they are watered from a single water source and grow from a single plot of earth. This type of discernment or this type of meditation and reflection and evidence, which we have indicated here, is sufficient in achieving the perfection of faith. We don't have to perfect our faith by knowing intricate philosophical arguments to prove the non eternity of the world or the existence of God in order for our faith to be considered perfect, like some of the scholars of Ilm al Kalam have said. And so when we look back, these are 4 points that Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio brings up. And these 4 points, in some ways, what they do is explain for us what he's saying in Umdat al-Muta'abidin, in the reliance of the devoted worshipper. Let's read it again now after having read that and connect some of the things that have been said with what's in the text. He says, I have composed this text in order to explain what Allah Ta'ala says in His book and what His Messenger says in His Sunnah concerning the foundations of the deen, the sciences of the outward and inward branches of deen. I have not included in it the legal extractions of the scholars. In other words, he didn't go into a lot of details, right? Neither in points of aqidah, nor in points of fiqh, nor in points of the basics of the life of the heart. He says that Abdul Wahhab al-Sharani mentioned, verily Allah has made all of His servants responsible only for what is explicitly known. So how can we be responsible for knowledge that's not understandable? So the knowledge has to be understandable, so that means that it has to be clear and easy. And what is meant here is that the pious worshiper and the adab believer should act according to what is explicitly mentioned. In other words, what's obligatory to know at the basic level in the book and the sunnah, and not by the details that are drawn out by the scholars, which that's a scholastic, it's an academic. In other words, it needs coursework, it needs to study, it needs to sit under scholars, right? That's important. And then he says, the desired knowledge in the above is that which Allah has made explicitly clear. In other words, has made an obligation. He's made it an obligation. This is the knowledge for which the servant will be questioned about in the hereafter. With all of that, there is no harm in it, and it is not difficult for anyone to obtain. In obtaining this knowledge, one is not in need of spending one's whole lifetime nor to overcome obstacles, right? And this is something to think about. A lot of times, what do we give the impression to the people that they have to know Arabic, they have to know this, they have, and that's why we have a clash. Because you have one group that's saying deen is supposed to be easy, and you have another group saying, well, we have knowledge in Islam, but what's happening is that we're confusing the levels of knowledge. This one group also wants everything to be just clear and easy, and they kind of disrespect the scholars. And sometimes the scholars, or those that want scholarly knowledge, they make things so complicated that they forget the ease. That is an issue in pedagogy, or what we call tarbiyah. It's a lack of rabbaniyah. The Quran talks about the concept of a rabbaniyah. To be rabbani, and is taken from the word Rabb, is to take and go stage by stage with something until it matures and grows. So we can't be Rabbani as teachers for ourselves and for our children if we're not going stage by stage. So then he says, in obtaining this knowledge, one is not in need of spending one's whole lifetime nor to overcome obstacles. This is because its meaning basically entails performing certain actions and avoiding certain actions. Clear cut. That does not stop the common people from understanding it, contrary to what is prescribed by the scholars of Ijtihad and the Imams. Their knowledge is more specialized. In reality, no one will be questioned in the hereafter about what they have prescribed, about their position. And you have some people that think that they're going to be questioned about why didn't they follow Abu Hanifa, or why didn't they. I've heard that they're going to be questioned by the Tabi'een. This is not true. This belief is not true. Uh, that complicates the issue. We're not going to be questioned about whether we followed a madhab or didn't follow a madhab, but we will be questioned about our salah. And we can know our salah at a basic level. You understand what I'm saying? The madhab is for those details, but the basics of the salah, you don't need to know a madhab with a lot of intricacy to know the basics of the salah. It helps, it aids, but we have to make sure that we separate between detailed knowledge which the madhab provides and that which should be clear for us. That's the job of the teachers to do. In reality, no one will be questioned in the hereafter about what they have prescribed the scholars, along with the fact that in what they have laid down there is difficulty and harm. In other words, you have to put time into it, sacrifice to know. One is in need of an entire lifetime and to overcome many obstacles in obtaining this knowledge, and that's well known, right? And then the principle is mentioned in the sub-commentary: Allah desires ease for you, He does not desire hardship for you. Allah, Allah says He has not made in the religion that which is difficult. It's quoting from the Quran by translation. So let's finish off our section for today, and this is on page 8. The science of the foundations of the Deen, or Ilm Usul ad-Din. I say in successes with Allah, realize that Allah Ta'ala has established all of the foundations of the Deen, or Usul ad-Din in the Quran. That which pertains to who Allah is, that's which pertains to who the Prophet is and our obligations to Allah and the Prophet, and that which pertains to knowledge of the unseen, the ilm al-ghaib, right? And so there he's laying down the foundations for what is the source, the primary source of Aqidah, and what is the knowledge that we should know from Aqidah, and how is it that we should teach Aqidah. So primary source for Aqidah should be the Quran. What's necessary to know is that which is obligatory to know. It should be clear. It should be easy for the people without involving them in a lot of intricacies. We mentioned some of these things before, but we added on a number of different comments that hopefully will expand out the knowledge a little bit and make it a little more clear. And on this note, we come to an end, and we ask Allah wa ta'ala to accept from us and to forgive us and to aid us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yes, the idea of contemplation on the creation has been lost. And unfortunately, there's another factor that should be mentioned, and that is that when you live in an urban environment, part of what happens in an urban environment is that you're not exposed as much to the creation, right? So urban environments create their own difficulty, right? That's why environments in which you're exposed to the uh, the natural realm in a lot more easy way, it's beneficial to be in those environments, even if it means that you go to the park or you go to the ocean or you go to the lake. You should always expose yourself to that which is going to remind you of what's greater than the human being, or what's greater than human achievement, or greater than human problems. And so when you look at the universe itself, the universe is considered a book. So we have 2 books, or 3 books actually, that we follow. The book of creation, right? In the big sense, and the book of creation in the little sense is ourselves, the human being, is a book that tells us about Allah wa ta'ala. And then there's the book of Revelation. Or you can just say the book of creation and the book of Revelation, right? And so the signs of Allah in the horizons and within ourselves, to reflect upon them, is a Quranic principle. The Quran points to these realities. And so this is a type of understanding that's missing. And you have some scholars that focus on that. And that is something that's being revived, in the thinking of Sheikh Uthman and Fodio, that type of thinking, versus just focusing on rational proofs based on logic as being the signs or as being the proofs for Aqidah. The reality is that the universe is full of signs and proofs for Aqidah, as well as the Quran. And so the Quran, it highlights these realities. I had a teacher, Dr. Taha Jabir, rahmatullahi alayhi, Dr. Taha Jabir, and he focused a lot on that, about the relationship between the Quran and the universe, and how it is that they clarify each other, right? So the creation, it helps us to go deeper into revelation, and the revelation helps us to interpret the creation, right? And so they don't contradict each other, because they come from the knowledge that come from them. Don't contradict each other because they come from the same source. So we have to learn how to work with those two branches of knowledge, and even knowledge of the human being, where you look at the human being and the healing process and the development process. All those are signs of the creator and the sustainer, Allah. You know. Also, people like Imam Said Nursi, he had a similar concept. But sometimes what happens in that type of reflection is that people go overboard. That's why it's important to focus on the Quran. We have to be careful that how we understand the natural world, so that it doesn't become a contradiction. So that the natural world doesn't become a contradiction. It doesn't become a an arena for pantheism. Okay. So with that, we come to an end, people. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.